Hey guys, what's cracking? Godsman here, coming at you with another discussion video. Divine Season 2 is just around the corner, baby, and with it comes the long-awaited reveal of the 6 Destined One units. And we got one heck of a teaser recently in the Bushiroad livestream, where the 6 artworks for each of these units, as well as their pilots and their pilots' respective bios, were revealed to us, giving us one heck of a hint ahead of time for the season that'll be airing in early July. However, one thing that Bushi conveniently omitted were the effects for the 6 Destined Ones, making it a complete mystery as not even a hint was mentioned about any of them as to what they could do. And so for this video, let's go ahead and try and dig into just what it is that each of the Destined Ones could be bringing to the table for their respective nations. Now, of course, it's very opinion based what I'm doing here, but I do want to give a lot of my perspective on what the aesthetics, the names, and also the characteristics of their respective users could imply about any potential effects for the 6 Destined Ones. And to add a little bit of spice at the very end, I will be sharing a custom card of my own creation for each of the 6 Destined Ones, sharing what it is that I personally believe they would do when revealed in IRL Vanguard. And with that all being the case, let's go ahead and quickly run down the game plan, as I'll be introducing each of the 6 Destined Ones, talking about their users, going over their general name and aesthetic, and then sharing that custom card at the end. So there's your agenda there. We've got a lot to talk about, so let's go ahead and get right into it. I hope you enjoy. So then let's kick things off with the Dragon Empire representative. We have the Destined One of Scales, Aqua Libra, being piloted by Kiyoma Kurosaki. Now, Kiyoma's bio reads as the following: Vice CEO of the Kyoto Group and the owner of the Destined One of Scales. Best friend since college days with Taizo, who's the CEO of the group. Man, a few words, he's the cool but reasonable type. So, judging by the bio and the name of the Destined One of Scales, balance is quite clearly the name of the game here when it comes to Aqua Libra. This could be implemented in a few ways when it comes to the Dragon Empire type game plan, because everyone is going to think about retiring or some other form of board control, since it is, of course, Dragon Empire. One way you could take this character is you might have a retire from the opponent's board lead to a superior call on your side of the board. This is one way to interpret the idea of scales, right? Perfectly balanced, all things good thing. You have one unit fall as another one rises. This does reference a little bit to some aspects of Dragon Empire, which muster based off of retires. Something like Dracobatical as a card, which utilizes this type of effect. Eugene also tends to muster the troops, so you might have something with Eugene type aesthetics. However, I prefer to think about it in the sense of an effect that could wipe out cards from both sides of the field until they're even with each other. Namely, let's say that the opponent had 2 rear guards and you had 4 rear guards. You would have to get rid of 2 after a certain point in the game, and if it's vice versa, they would have to get rid of 2, maintaining a perfect equilibrium between both sides of the field. Now, getting rid of doesn't necessarily have to be retires. You could even have classic Narukami type binding. This is something that is a sorely unexplored region of the Dragon Empire card pool, as not many Dragon Empire units bind, and even the cards that do bind don't really expand upon the bind gimmick to a point of making an entire deck dedicated to that focus. So Aqua Libra brings the perfect opportunity to bring this into the fold once more, and his artwork actually does suggest a bit of that Thunder Dragon, Desert Gunner kind of style mixed into the aesthetic. Now, as for what I think the bind zone gimmick could bring to the table, we of course have the idea of ramping, right? The more binds that you accrue in the opponent's bind zone, the more you'll be able to obtain effects, very much like the classic G Narukami playstyle of the Thunderstrike keyword. However, we might also see the opposite, which is that Dunkery type playstyle where you're binding your own rear guards and cards in order to gain power, which funnily enough Gundiva as a deck strategy also somewhat used this type of premise, so it may not be entirely unfounded to utilize support such as Barnia in order to increase your own bind zone count. This could even apply to both sides of the field. Perhaps it's counting from both binds, so you're binding your own cards and you're binding the opponent's cards, which does give that kind of give and take relationship that comes with equilibrium and the scales, quote unquote. Another aspect of scales is judgment, right? When we judge something to be bringing things out of balance, we strike them down so they come back into balance, much like a Thunderstrike, pun intended. This leads to the Divine skill, where I believe the Divine skill is going to scale based off of the bind zone. Now, you could add in some really unique premises here, such as ripping the opponent's hand until it's equal with yours, of course, and that's where the scales come into play, but I'm personally under the impression that bind zone is the way to go, baby. And because of that, we would have to think about what ramping up the bind zone would do for a supremely punishing endgame effect. Now, this is what's going to lead me over to my custom card that I made for Aqua Libra, which has these effects. Auto on the Vanguard circle at the end of either player's turn. If a player has more rear guards than their opponent, they must bind cards from the rear circle equal to the difference. This is the balancing act that I was talking about before, where both players have to constantly get rid of any excess rear guards in order to maintain equilibrium with their opponent. So the more that you overextend, the more you lose balance and thus have to fall flat on your butt. Auto on the Vanguard circle. When this unit attacks Vanguard, cost Energy Blast 3. Choose 2 of your rear guards in the same column and they get power plus 5,000. And if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, Soul Blast 1 and stand those units. At the end of the battle phase, bind those units. This gives Aqua Libra some form of multi-attack and pressure versus the opponent. It's only multi-attack if the opponent's grade 3 or greater though, so you don't bum rush them right away. I do believe in good card design that way, but the real kicker of this effect is that you bind your units, and that's really one of the cool ideas that I have for Aqua Libra as the deck strategy, is that you can gain power temporarily, but then you have to get rid of your own cards. But by getting rid of your own cards, you're facilitating the auto effect and even weaponizing it against your opponent, because now it's more likely that they'll have to pay the detrimental cost of removing some of their rear guards in order to maintain the equilibrium with you. This is where it gets really thought-provoking as a deck strategy, because you're either going to be helped or hindered by that first effect depending on how you play, but the second auto skill gives you a good aggression option that also feeds into the first auto skill naturally. Finally, we have the Divine skill, which is an act on the Vanguard circle. Cost Counterblast 1 and send all bound cards of all fighters to their respective drop zones. Choose one of your opponent's Vanguards and it gets power minus 1k for every card sent to the drop zones. Then, if the power of the opponent's Vanguard is 0 or less, and they have 4 or less cards in their damage zone, deal it 1 damage. The power increase of a triggered damage check by this effect is nullified. So a couple things that led to the creation of this Divine skill. I mentioned earlier that the ramp is sort of like judgment, a penance if you will. The more cards that are bound, the more sins that are stacked up. And then all those sins are to come crashing down at once and punish the opponent. This comes in the form of power reduction and also ping. The power reduction part of it is an homage to Welstra, as Kyokura Group here has the Vice CEO versus the CEO presumably as rivals for this upcoming season 2. So I wanted something that reflects the Yudiante type gimmick of damage pinging and also reducing power. However, unlike Yudiante where you only have to wait 1 turn to do it and then you get that static benefit every time, this one could be even more devastating by Yudiante to quite the degree, and if you actually do build it up to presumably 13 or more and reduce them down to 0 power, the damage ping is superior. And an interesting little side note, this damage ping is a reference to some old Dragon Empire classic units like the Vortex Legion and also Nouvelle Vague, where they nullify trigger effects, meaning that you won't be able to get any defensives, or even for some of them you could even have trigger effects in general, like heal triggers and whatnot. I decided to leave that in there and only keep the power down. The idea being that you can't resolve the consequences of your actions, and the consequences is the power. But the effects are something different, and that honestly would have been a little bit too punishing to stop, like, say, the over trigger effect. But stopping the over trigger power increase, well, that's fair play right there, isn't it? So I decided this was the perfect balance, pun intended, between a really strong effect that also maintains the thematic premise of the unit in general. I'd say this would be a pretty solid and cool strategy to really bring Dragon Empire back to its control type gameplay roots, as well as also bring that Narukami type game plan back to the surface again, because we're sorely lacking that playstyle. And with the Divine skill being a sort of a counter to Welstra in a sort of ways, it would be a pretty epic moment to see Taizo get pounded this and may or maybe not surviving the turn afterwards. Since it is a 6v6 presumably, there's going to be some casualties on both sides of the field, quote unquote. So I don't know how that fight would go, but presuming it'd be an effect like this, I think it'd be quite the show, wouldn't you? Now, before we move on to the Dark States unit, this would be the perfect time for me to throw down a spoiler warning, because this unit and also one of the Destined One is going to bring with them pretty major spoilers for the end of Divine Season 1, as well as Will Dress Season 3. So for those of you who haven't caught up on those anime seasons yet, please do so, or forever be spoiled, I suppose. You have been warned. Anyway, for the Dark States representative, we have the Destined One of Time, Leodium, being piloted by Hikari, the original timeline Hikari to be exact, as that is a very important distinction given the lore of the series. Now, this is quite the fascinating Wii Train pick, and not a lot of people saw this one coming. As a matter of fact, most people would have wanted something like Michiru, Donji, Sophie Bell, maybe even Helena to come back. There was a lot of very ripe apples to pick when it came to the representative for Dark States, but they chose Hikari, and there has to be a really big major lore reason behind it, which is hinted by her bio, which reads, third-year middle schooler, owner of the Destined One of Time. She keeps being in and out of the hospital due to a weak body, but was able to become healthy due to her big brother Akina efforts. She seems to still be buddy-buddy with her big brother, but ellipses question mark. This is quite the ominous bio, and it does reference perhaps the biggest thing that throws most of the community off about Hikari's presence here, which is that the main issue in her plotline for Season 1 was that she had very poor health. That was resolved thanks to Reziel's miracle at the end of Season 1. So it's quite puzzling why it is that she's driven to have a Destined One, and more importantly, driven against Akina to some regard or another. Even in a recent trailer, it was shown through both positional and dialogue understanding that she is kind of Akina's rival for this upcoming season, which is both tragic and quite puzzling. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that per se, but it does lead to some interesting thoughts when it comes to what Leodium can do. Now, talking about Leodium's design and aesthetic here, it's quite clear that she went back to her Gear Chronicle roots. You can see it all over in her design, and this is somewhat sensible because in the lore, Lia Fel was originally a Gear Chronicle unit, but there was a bit of a paradox that occurred with her which drove her to be a Keter Sanctuary unit temporarily. However, Odium here appears to be in more of her true form this time around, and because it is a Gear Chronicle form, the number one most obvious thing people are going to think about is the Time Leap mechanic, which Time Leap is the ability to bind one of your rear guards and then call a card from the deck whose grade is +1 of the unit bound. Now, this could tie into many different aspects of the Dark States card pool. Something like Time Stamping Dragon already utilizes the Time Leap gimmick to quite a good degree, and maybe we could try to expand on whatever support could tie these two decks together. There's not a lot of specific support to time stamping because A, it was a promo, and B, it was relatively new and geared towards utilizing the generic Dark States pool rather than having a specific pool to itself, but it did have a couple supports like Gear Goat. ODM in a similar way might be able to use the greater pool in a myriad of ways if it does have that time leap going for it. Now, one thing that could separate her from Lia Fel is that Lia Fel put cards of the same grade from the deck to the field to whatever she bound. So we already have a premise for that time leap. This being able to take it forward would be quite cool, or it could actually be backwards, a reverse leap where you actually call a unit that's grade -1 of whatever it is that you bound. The idea here being that she's stuck in the past, always looking to the past rather than to the present or to the future, which is kind of a symbolic thing as Vanguards generally get their power from looking to the future, i.e. strides and the concept of drive checks, right? So in that way, this could be somewhat of a self-harmful kind of cycle. The name Leodium is also quite fascinating because Odium refers to general or widespread hatred or disgust directed towards someone as a result of their actions. This could be hatred or disgust towards Akina, perhaps for whatever happened on the camping trip and maybe him healing her despite risking his life to do so and lying to her about the very dangerous fights that he went on, or it could actually be self-hatred, perhaps her weakness and inability to help out her big brother. Again, maybe that camping trip is going to throw some context that makes her resent her own being and actions. It's hard to say, but the name of Odium does hint something there, and it could even, if we're taking the more angel feather side of things, refer to a sort of a self-harm type gimmick where you damage yourself, or more specifically your Vanguard, in order to get a very powerful effect. Think of Malkuth Malik, who took a damage in order to call 3 units from the drop zone. This is somewhat angel feathery, but also in a self-loathsome type of way, so I think there might be some potential there, but it is a bit out there, particularly because because almost nothing in the Dark Stakes card pool would actually operate with this type of game plan. There's nothing there to help it, so it would be incredibly niche and really, I suppose you would call it xenophobic to the card pool. One other interesting aspect here is it could get rid of your soul cards, i.e. binding them, maybe putting them back to deck, just getting rid of your soul. This also have a self-resentment thing because when you get rid of your own soul, you're weakening yourself, right? So there is that odium element tying in, but if they are being bound from the soul, this could oddly tie into the Blankmire type gimmick, which may be a pretty cool element if it turns out that Suel does get redeemed in Hikari's eyes when they end up squaring off, if they square off. That is an if, but it is a pretty important part that future Hikari had quite the grudge against Suel, so maybe if Suel could redeem himself in present Hikari, it'll bring that whole plot point full circle. So seeing Leodium work with Blankmire type of way, maybe a defensive type skill, much in the same way that Amorta could work with Reziel. Amorta protected Fated Ones. Maybe when it comes to Leodium, it could protect units with Divine skills, and you could get very much that parallel, and it would be quite interesting from the thematic point. The Divine skill could do a turn-wide reset, like negating damage, which is very much like how Reziel negates damage, but in more of an absolute way, whereas Reziel has to rely on a miracle. The Divine skill could also do a typical restand going forward in time. A restand versus a reride would be quite powerful in an evolution of the gimmick, especially because doing a restand might be more powerful than the reride, as you get to maintain your trigger effects on the restanding unit. Although if the attack skill is a once per turn, and that's presuming there is an attack skill to quote-unquote time leap, that could be a trade-off. Anyway, with all those different aspects go out of the way, here's what I've got for a custom card for Leodium. So this card's got 3 effects. The first one being auto on the Vanguard circle once per turn. When this unit attacks or is attacked, cost Counterblast 1. Choose a card from your soul and bind it. Search your deck for up to 1 unit with the same grade as the card bound +1 without Sentinel, and call it to rear circle if it is your turn, or Guardian circle if it is your opponent's turn. This is the classic time leap type gimmick, but interestingly enough, not only did I decide to make it somewhat defensive, I also decided that it would be somewhat prudent to have it be a bind from the soul, right? And this is where you can tie in the Dark Stakes type thing of soul charging a lot of cards, and that soul becomes your toolbox to utilize when you're calling from the deck. It's somewhat eloquent, and it does have a pretty cool mirror because binding from the rear means that you're mustering from the rear continuously, which is the Keter way of doing things, whereas mustering from the souls of the field is more the Dark Stakes way of doing things. Now, the secondary skill is a complete reference to the Guardian skill that Amorta got, which is auto when this unit is put on the Guardian circle. If your Vanguard is a unit with Divine skill, choose a card from your hand and bind it. Choose one of your Vanguards, and it cannot be hit until the end of battle. At the end of that battle, bind this unit. So this, of course, is just like Amorta, but interestingly enough, instead of returning cards from the bind zone to the deck, I decided to actually increase the number of binds. Now, this isn't necessarily meant to be a scaling mechanism. It's meant more as a brutal kind of consequence type of thing, where not only does this unit have to bind, you have to bind the card in hand, which is very harsh as far as punishment goes, but it's a very self-punishing unit. That's what Liel kind of is in my eyes, potentially, as a card. So I wanted to implement that kind of more edgy aspect, if you will. I mean, heck, Dark States is somewhat edgier than a lot of the other nations there, so it kind of fits that way. Anyway, for the big kahuna, the Divine skill, we have another auto skill, this one on Vanguard circle. When this unit is attacked, choose a Destined One of Time, Leodium in your bind zone, and write it as stand. That unit gets power plus 5,000 and drive plus 1 until the end of your next turn. So this one I kind of cooked with a little bit because the idea behind this is twofold. Now, obviously, it takes the idea of the Divine skill from Leomorta to reride, but it takes it in a defensive direction, because when a Vanguard is attacked, if you place a new Vanguard in the middle of that attack no longer has a target and therefore cannot hit your new Vanguard. So in a way, you can consider it a pseudo-free PG, but you have to do the reride. This compounds in the defensive element even more because the extra 5,000 power and drive plus 1 is going to remain for all of that turn and your next turn, meaning that you'll have an 18k base Vanguard for the opponent to try and plow through. This plus the first effect, which can be reset, mind you, as you rewrite a new Destined One at a time, so you can still counterblast again, despite the once per turn clause, means that it's almost impossible to kill Leodium on that turn. It's much more of an absolute damage negation versus Reziel's Miracle, and it's also somewhat protective versus Immorta, where Immorta was way more aggressive as a unit, so there's sort of a duality there, like the light and shadow kind of difference. The drive +1 is a direct opposition to the minus drive that Immorta got, but is a reference in turn to Reziel's drive +1 that it got with its divine skills. So there's a lot of different references being put here. Of course, at the end of the day, there's a lot of ways that Immorta can be taken, but between the permanent binds, the utilization of more defensive properties, and the time leap, there is a lot of ways that Dark States could try and use this card pool, and also link it to the Blankmeyer type of game plan, or heck, even Omni Grujo and what's her name? Astro Unica, right? Which those two units also bind cards, particularly triggers in those cases, but still it's bound cards. So we're building more and more of a foundation to be binding a lot of your cards in order to get very powerful effects. One thing I'll note is that this divine skill is somewhat hard to set up, as you will need to bind Leodium, and notably you can't really bind Leodium from your soul unless you have a grade 4 call target, which I believe would be a really prudent support card to give Odium right off the bat so that you can get that set up easier. Otherwise, you will have to find an Odium in the hand and bind it using its Guardian Circle skill, which is somewhat similar to how Immorta worked, where you would have to find the Immorta persona right and rewrite it and then soul blast the previous copy. So it all ties together quite well. Anyway, that's all I've got for Odium, so let's go ahead and move on to our Brandt Gate representative. That being the Destined One of Exceedance, Imp Pao. Now, this epic-looking unit is being piloted by Senka Kanai, whose bio reads, Pro Vanguard Fighter, owner of the Destined One of Exceedance, now's childhood friend, one of the good skilled young fighters, battle-holic with a short fuse. Yeah, there's a little bit to talk about with this one because Senka was revealed a bit earlier on in the first season of Divinez, and so it was pretty clear that she was going to end up being a rival for now. And in that rivalry, and also the idea of this character being a battle-holic, we're going to be looking at a very aggressive unit here right away. That much is almost without debate. Now, I know a lot of people are going to look at this aesthetic and design and say, oh, that's Messiah right there, like straight, clear as day. And I will say that it does look quite a bit like Messiah. However, given the more aggressive tone of the unit, especially Exceedance, Battleholic, I'm going to interpret it more as a Death Army type unit. In other words, as a Nova Grappler unit. And in that way, there's a lot of ways that you could take a somewhat Nova Grappler type design, although I will say it is a little bit weird to have a Nova Grappler type design coming out so soon after we got Rotovisor, but, you know, they'll probably just take it a different direction, right? So with those vibes, I'm thinking of a multi-attack type style of deck. Now that multi-attack could be restands, of course, or it could also be superior calling mid-battle from the Order Zone. That's something that we see with some decks, particularly Welstra, but not with all decks, so you could expand on that element of Brandt Gate quite a bit more. Another idea is that this could be a robot building kind of deck, working towards the Ultimate Fighter. The Ultimate Fighter being a symbol of Senka's self-perception, being that sort of pro-type fighter at the top of the world. So, in a similar way, your units could be trying to develop your main Vanguard, who gets progressively more strong as time goes on, and although that is a little bit more of a dimensional robo-type style, admittedly, it could still tie into the overall aesthetic because it is a huge, really cool looking robot at the end of the day, let's be real. Another element that you could take is a forced battle type of element, where your opponent's rears must goad the opponent's rears into doing battle with them rather than the Vanguard, as a sort of a survival of the fittest. Speaking of survival of the fittest, it could also be mutual destruction, where rear guards attack each other and then blow up afterwards, thus only leaving the Vanguard at the top of the food chain. You could also see a main skill that is a recall from the Order Zone to get more pawns out there to do battle with, or the main skill could be using rears to build the Vanguard, much like Scrap. So in other words, it assimilates them to the larger board of its being to be the ultimate battle droid. Divine skill wise, you could see a massive call for the multi-attack route, or it could be a stark like multi-attack for the Vanguard if we're going for the ultimate Vanguard beatdown route. So different kind of ways. If it's a massive Vanguard multi-attack, you could get 3 multi-attacks as a way of countering Varga Dragras, who is also a triple Vanguard multi-swinger, but that might might be a little bit too cumbersome, and we don't want 2 divine skills to prop for 3 extra attacks, although admittedly Amorta did do that as well, but it wasn't 3 Vanguard multi-attacks, so you get my drift, right? Anyway, here's what I think this unit could do. Auto on the Vanguard circle. When your rear guard's attack hits, your opponent chooses one of their rear guards and retires it. Choose up to 1 card from your drop zone and put it face down on your Vanguard circle as a scrap gauge. Survival of the fittest. When the opponent's rear guard battle falls, it's going to go as scrap in order to build up your Vanguard. Auto on the Vanguard circle. When your rear guard attacks or the attack it boosted does not hit, put that unit face down on your Vanguard circle as a scrap gauge. This effect is mandatory. So similar to the opponent's falling, if your rear guards fail to actually make their mark, then they're going to be the ones turned into scrap instead. It's a very violent, Darwinistic kind of way of building a deck strategy, but it is also very cool. The Divine skill is an act of the Vanguard circle. Cost Energy Blast 9. Yes, I'm not joking. Until end of turn, your opponent cannot intercept, and this unit gets the following skill. Auto on the Vanguard circle. When your opponent puts a card on the Guardian circle, cost Counterblast 1 and send a scrap gauge to the drop zone and retire that unit. This is a little bit of the DP type thing of breaking through guards, but also because it's not just for your Vanguard attack, and it could be for the opponents as well. You're also somewhat assisting the Nova Grappler type game plan. And the Nova Grappler type game plan is really what this relates back to at the end of the day as well, because even the retires was something that Novas did a fair bit, where they would retire cards of the opponent's side of the field whose power was less than or equal to the unit that was attempting to do the retire. So it all relates back beautifully to this ultimate battle showdown between 2 godly forces, right? And I do say that this is a pretty good effect on its own, but given that it is a Brandt Gate card, we should have a set order for this unit. So I am going to make an exception for Imp Pao and do a set order for it. And here's what the set order would do. Scrap Factory, Grade 1 set order, Brandt Gate. Continuous during your turn, your Vanguard with Imp Pao and its card name gets power plus 2,000 for every scrap gauge underneath it. If that unit has 5 or more gauges, it gets critical plus 1. If it has 8 or more, and your opponent is grade 3 or greater, it gets the following skill. Auto on the Vanguard circle once per turn. At the end of the battle this unit attacked, stand this unit and it gets drive -2. These effects do not stack, aka multiple scrap factories are not going to give multiple instances of this continuous skill. Act cost rest this card. Choose a card from your drop and put it face down on your Vanguard circle as a scrap gauge. Yep, you just build scrap. Act cost Soul Blast 1 and put this card into your drop zone, choose a scrap gauge from your Vanguard circle, and call it to rear guard. So with this, you build scrap. The scrap gauges actually give inherent benefits to only your Vanguard, and you can also recall scrap gauges in order to make up for the lost units on the field, as technically the second skill of Imp Pao could be seen as neg-1s or even neg-2s every time you fail to hit, which is quite savage when you think about it. But it is all leading up to the excellence, nay, the exceedance of this Vanguard. So it is a very worthy sacrifice, but if you do need to build back board, then you can sacrifice the scrap factory itself instead in order to get that going. Overall, a pretty brutal type style that I've come up with, but I think it does match the very aggressive, straightforward personality that we've seen so far from Senka. Not too much about her, but between the bio and the little mannerisms that she's shown, this doesn't seem too far outside of her ballpark, to be completely frank. Moseying on over to the Keter Sanctuary representative, we have the other returning unit and returning character in the form of Jinky Mukai with his Destined One protection, Alden. This one was a pretty hype surprise, not gonna lie, as Alden does have his fair share of fans, and Jinky as a character had a lot less to offer when it came to the end of Wheelchest Season 3, so I'm glad they are making him return. Now, here's what we got for Jinky's bio. Organizer of Deluxe, the tournament to decide who's the strongest, owner of the Destined One protection. Alongside the AI Gui created by his deceased big brother Shinji, he's the mastermind of the Uniformers project. Yep, that is all. So quite literally nothing we don't already know, unfortunately. This is the only bio where I can't really use it in order to decide what Alden's going to do, but thankfully it is the unit that's already probably the most defined out of the 6 because we have 2 versions of Alden to build off of prior. Now, of course, the number one thing when we think about Alden, we think about the Pot of Greed skill, Draw to Effect, and that should almost certainly be incorporated into this version of Alden. It's a part of his very identity ever since set 1 when he was a Bastion support card. The main skill could incorporate a mid-battle superior call. This is something that's also very much like Alden. The Sword that connects Heaven and Earth did this in a pretty big way by bouncing and recalling, and I think we could maintain that type of effect with Alden as well, maybe emphasizing a little bit more on the self-bounce style in Keter, as Keter does have a couple of self-bounce type of cards, but there's no Vanguard that can really unify them into a meaningful direction. So we might see a little bit more of that style expanded on, which will give Alden even more of his own identity within the Keter card space. Another idea, and I do particularly like this idea given its more Gold Paladin theming, is to make Alden act more defensively and use a Golden Holy Sword Gurga type effect, which for those of you who don't know what that card did, it allowed you to move cards from your field to the Guardian Circle, meaning that you can effectively use your field as an extra hand in order to defend yourself. It meant that the card advantage that you got being a Gold Paladin could be maximally beneficial, as even with it being on the field, it could still help protect your life. So that and the superior calling, and then also subsequently the self-bouncing and the Pot of Greed effect, all means that Alden is going to be quite defensive, as his moniker of the Destined One protection would imply. Of course, the one thing about Alden to consider is that different grades are still one of his stipulations. He was the sort that connected the heavens and the earth, so the poor piddly grades and the higher haughty grades all came together in order to unify against a greater threat. And that should still be maintained to some degree when it comes to Alden. So here's what I cooked up when it came to a potential skill for Alden. Out on the Vanguard Circle, when this unit attacks, cost Counterblast 1 and Soul Blast 1, which is a reference to the previous Aldens also having both of those costs on them. Choose one of your rear guards and return to your hand. Look at the top 5 cards of your deck, choose up to 2 units whose total grade is less than or equal to the total grade of the card returned, and call them to rear circle in the same column. Divine skill, act Vanguard Circle cost. Energy Blast 4 and choose 3 cards from your drop zone with different grades and shuffle them into your deck. Draw 2 cards. Until the end of your opponent's next turn, you get the following skill. All of your units on rear circle cannot be affected by your opponent's card effects and get power plus 5,000. So simply put, this is quite literally everything we already talked about regarding Alden. It has Pot of Greed, it has Superior Call, it has the self-bounce, it has the protection element being put to the next level with the divine skill. Now, initially, I wanted to have this divine skill last until the end of the fight. However, that would have been far too busted for a unit like Alden, as being able to keep that board just shuts down so many field control decks. So we're only going to keep it until the end of the opponent's next turn. In a similar way, I also decided that the Superior Call main effect there should be able to call from the deck rather than purely from the hand, as it does dig a little bit more into that Golds type aesthetic that we continue to see him have. But it is the aspect of Alden that is technically new, all things considered, as neither of the previous versions of Alden's actually looked into the deck in any capacity. They just drew cards. So this is where it's a bit new, so to speak. It's what freshens him up from the previous iterations. Everything else, though, it does feel pretty up to snuff. One interesting element is the idea of throwing 3 cards with different grades into the drop zone. Because they're different grades, it not only results in Alden's theming of different grades coming together, but it does prevent you from throwing back 3 triggers, presumably, unless you're playing something like the premium format, which you can't even do that because there's no energy in the premium format. So you will, and your best scenario, probably be throwing back a trigger, a PG, and also a Persona Ride, or maybe a really powerful unit. It just goes to show that it is a strong aspect of the cost, where the cost is a benefit, much like Chris Rain's Divine Skill, but not so much of a benefit that it's inherently game-breaking. So between the different costs and effects here, I'd say this does make Alden out to be a pretty, well, self-sufficient kind of unit. He does help out all of his rear guards in various ways, power up, superior call, protection, all that good stuff, but ultimately it is going to come down to the merit of the rear guards to really push Alden over the edge there. And you have cards like Light Leads Dragon, which already helps do just that, in addition to whatever new cards that he might get as a support down the line. Moving on to Stoicheia, we've got the Destined One of Infinity, Levy Dress. Ooh, this is one that a lot of people were looking forward to, and how could they not? Everything about this card just screams cool. The insect dragon looking appearance, the bioluminescent wings, and even the user himself, Kuon Aikawa, is nothing if not cool, as suggested by his bio, which reads, transfer student into Akina and Suo's class, owner of the Destined One of Infinity, called genius high schooler by the public due to winning contests, hard to grasp what he's thinking with a mysterious aura. So this is slated to be the rival for Suo, and you can sort of judge that through a couple ways, aside from, of course, the trailer lining the up, physically looking at each other side by side, right? Kuo as a character seems to be rather standoffish and maybe even a bit of a kudere, which is somewhat relating to how Suo was fairly antisocial in the first season. I mean, to the point of deep depression and repression as a character, but, you know, that's neither here nor there, as Suo got broken out of that thanks to Akina's very big bro high five, right? That aside, the idea of a Destined One of Infinity is in direct opposition to what Blankmeyer, who's the fated one of Zero, would be. Infinity versus Zero, opposite concepts there. So let's get into some things that Levy Dress might do. Now, when thinking about Levy Dress, a lot of people look at the insect dragon type of thing and want to go for the mega colony type of game plan, right? We're talking about paralyzing units, making sure they don't stand up, and there is a little bit of a base for that. One card that we got was the cycle cards, right? The ones that when you place them during Persona Ride, you can counterblast and activate an effect, and when you discard them during your ride phase, you can Soul Blast and put them on the bottom of the deck in order to get an effect. Now, the one for Stoicheia here actually had a skill to paralyze your opponent's rear guards. This was a bit of an interesting, but also somewhat random include, as no decks in Stoicheia actually emphasize the Mega Colony style paralyzed gimmick, so we could see a return to that with Levy Dress potentially. However, I am going to go against the grain here and take it a different direction. See, the name Levy Dress implies the name Leviathan, right? As in a deep sea creature of untold horror. Now, that sea theme relates back to Zorga, and if you get where I'm going with this, I want to introduce the Grand Blue type game plan. Now that might seem a little bit puzzling, as Zorga already does do some revives, but Zorga as a deck is very preoccupied with the concept of Alchemagic and the order gimmicks. So the revival from the drop zone is less of the focus and more of an add-on that helps substantiate that deck's versatility. I want Levy Dress to actually emphasize this in a bigger way, being able to revive whatever it wants for the drop zone, and maybe even recur them back ad infinitum, which would relate back to the infinity premise by making an infinite recursion loop. Heck, maybe not even to the field, but also to the hand. The multiple combo lines is also somewhat related to Kuo's unpredictability, and if you are returning things to the drop zone, it does mean that they don't remain on the field for Blankmeyer to get rid of, which could net him rival points in order to antagonize the Blankmeyer gimmick. Now, in terms of divine skills, there is a couple ways that you could take this. The most apparent one that a lot of people really like to talk about, you can think of it like Obelisk, or maybe in a lesser way from Zoa, which is the Zeroth Dragon well, I say Stoicheia, but Zoo, that's how it was back then, right? This idea of infinite power unit that's a one-shot kill, right? That could be the divine skill, which is a very direct OTK kind of skill, which is somewhat like how Blankmeyer was, right? Blankmeyer was an OTK unit, but it did have lingering debilitating effects afterwards, so it's not purely all about the OTK, but it did have that very sudden end kind of feel to its game plan. Now, I don't particularly like this interpretation. However, the idea of infinity should still be a really big idea. Now, one other element of the divine skill, and this is going to be the idea that I personally go with, is a copying skill. As in, you choose one of your opponent's units, yes, including your Vanguard, and copy their effects. There's a couple reasons why I believe this might be Levy Dress's skill. For one thing, when you look at the wings look like mirrors, the reflections, right? So I can imagine that this creature actually will utilize the mirror wings in order to reflect whatever it is that's fighting against and then take on their appearance and abilities. Another idea as to why this would be the divine skill, in my opinion, is it's a direct opposition to Blankmeyer. See, Blankmeyer removes skills. He reduces them to 0, whereas Levy Dress has an infinite possibility of extra skills to gleam upon depending on what it is that he's fighting. So infinite possibilities versus no possibilities. That's where you get that duality there in full effect. Now, let's go ahead and mosey on over to the card that I made for Levy Dress. Now, this one's got 2 effects. The first one being auto on the Vanguard circle. When this unit attacks a Vanguard, cost Soul Blast 1 and choose one of your rear guards and retire it. Choose one of your opponent's rear guards and retire it. This unit gains power equal to the power of the retired units and drive +1 until end of turn. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, choose a card from your drop zone and call it to rear circle. This one is utilizing several properties of that retire, recall, being able to steal power is sort of like taking on that copying a bit, but to a lesser degree, right? Because what he's stealing is the drive and also the power, but not their full effect. So it's just a lesser degree of what the divine skill is going to be, which is act on the Vanguard circle. Choose one of your opponent's units or one of your units with Levy dress in its card text, and this unit gets all that unit's abilities and names until the end of the opponent's next turn. If you chose an opponent's unit and gained an ability with divine skill, you may activate it once in addition to this unit's divine skill. So this is definitely a pretty wicked skill, but it's just like what I said, right? Copying your opponent's cards and being able to use it against them. But I did add in a failsafe of one of your units with Levy dress. The reason why is if the opponent is extremely archetype blocker, just has nothing very useful for you, i.e. imagine this ever fought against Divine Welstra, where both of his skills just don't really matter at all because you do not have product orders in your deck, you can always fall back by copying one of your own cards. Now, I restricted it to only units with Levy dress in its card text because that would limit the Stoicheia future card pool if this card could copy any of their units, as then Bushy would be then inclined to have to limit what it is those cards can do so that Levy dress can't copy it and blow up the game in a very unbalanced sort of combo. Think about things like Castile Daimonis as a stripe which got banned because its ability to abuse the dark states, or well, more specifically the DI card pool, it became too overly abundant and disgusting, and it just broke the meta. So I want to avoid that with Levy dress, and interestingly enough, by saying Levy dress in its card text, it can actually copy its own skill, as it does technically have Levy dress in its card text right here. So you'll be able to use the win attack skill twice. In other words, Soul Blast 2, retire 2 rears, call 2 rears back, and get a quadruple drive. That is quite a powerful skill if I do say so myself. So at bare minimum, that will be your offense. But as for what your ceiling can be, well, really, the star's the limit when it comes to that, right? So that's what I've got for Levy dress here. I think it's a pretty cool unit. It's definitely not one with a ton of effects or even like a ton of pushing power per se. It's more of a stable Vanguard that focuses on card advantage and utility above all else in a similar way to how Reziel plays, right? Because nothing about Reziel screams hyper offensive. It's just calling a couple cards from the drop zone and also getting that defensive skill, right? So this one is sort of like that, where your rear guards are going to contextualize the power of it, whereas a couple other cards like Aqua Libra and also to another extent Imp Pao, although Imp Pao does need the help of its support card from the set order, whatever that ends up being. This one is a little bit more dependent on the rears helping it out, and it's not very self-sufficient, so you will have to rely on a very well-built deck, particularly a toolbox deck, I'd imagine, in order to make the most use out of a card like this. And now for last, we've got Lyrical Monasterio, but not least, if the name is anything to go by, as we turn to the Destined One of Supremacy, Lia Fel. Now, Lia Fel is definitely a somewhat memey looking card. It really is just a lyrical werebeast, so nothing too imposing about the art, especially in contrast to a card that's literally called the Destined One of Supremacy. But let's not judge a book by its cover. Same thing goes for the user, which is Yuna Sionji. Now, Yuna's description reads, first year high school student, owner of the Destined One of Supremacy, secret idol otaku, big fan of the idol Makoto Saito. Part of the student council, good at both studies and sports. So yeah, we've got a character who is somewhat of a fangirl, but also somewhat of an absolute unit, depending on how you interpret that bio, because being both a part of the student council, good at sports, studies, all that good stuff, yeah, this girl definitely gets out, and she's pretty good at what she does. But looking at Lia Fel, the immediate thing I want to see from this is somewhat of an homage to the Chris Rain style, but also somewhat of a perversion, or a contrast in other words, as this is a character who directly idolizes the character who's slated to be her rival. So there's going to be a pretty big comparison point between Lia Fel and Chris Rain. So I want that contrast to be the priority here. And what I mean by that contrast is a Vanguard that prioritizes herself, whereas Chris Rain is very rearguard centric. After all, Chris Rain's stipulations require you to have rearguards with different names, whereas my image for Lia Fel would be a card that is purely concerned about herself and her alone as the single idol. Now, this could come in a variety of ways. This could be a field removal type of lyrical gimmick where the field will empty itself, leaving her as the solo superstar. You could do the Shushu Hazard type style of bot decking rear guards in order to gain effects, which is also another way of leaving the Vanguard to do the heavy lifting. You could steal opponents' rear guards like idle stealing fans, which is an interpretation I'm particularly liking because it does relate quite a bit to the whole idea of this being an idle battle at the end of the day, right? And that is something that idols could sort of do against each other, is a popularity battle. Your divine skill is most likely going to be some sort of OTK end of performance type skill, just judging by this, because this does appear to be a very bombastic unit in both name and appearance. Well, maybe not so much appearance, but you get my drift, right? This is definitely one of the hardest ones to figure out a gimmick for, because the aesthetic, the name, the character, there's so little to go off of. So for this custom card, I had to kind of go outside the box here. So here's what I believe the Destined One of Supremacy Lia Fel could do. Continuous on the Vanguard circle. During your turn, this unit gets power plus 2000 for every idle counter amongst all fighters' rear guards. If your opponent's Vanguard is Great Fear greater, for every 5 idle counters, this unit gets critical +1, drive +1. Auto on the Vanguard circle. When this unit attacks a Vanguard, cost Soul Blast 1 and choose 3 cards in your hand and place them on the bottom of your deck. For every card put, your opponent may choose one of their rear guards without an idle counter, and those units get an idle counter. For every card not chosen, they choose 1 card from their hand and call it to a rear circle without a unit with an idle counter. Finally, Divine Skill. Auto on the Vanguard circle. At the end of the battle, this unit attack cost Counterblast 2. Choose all of your rear guards with an idle counter, return them to your hand. Choose any number of your opponent's rear guards with an idle counter, and move them to your rear circle. So yeah, very clearly the idea with this is you're trying to steal the opponent's cards and also mitigate like your own. You don't even really use your own. It's your Vanguard that's going to gain the bulwark of the power and the effects here, right? So this is a pretty stacked unit that way in my own interpretation. This I also had to cheat with a little bit here and give it a set order, but given that it is Lyrical Monasterio, they do have a passing fancy with a lot of very archetypal orders associated with them, and this set order here will take off the heat because it actually does give effects to idle counters aside from whatever it is Lia Fel could do with them, right? So this is super idle on stage. It's a grade 0 set order and it has 3 skills. Continuous. You can only play this order if you have a Vanguard with Lia Fel in its card name. Auto in the order zone. At the end of the battle that a rear guard attacks or boosts an attack on a Vanguard, those unit gets 1 idle counter. Continuous in the order zone. All units with an idle counter cannot attack, intercept, or be moved by a card ability except to another rear circle. So this right here is a stun effect, and the interpretation, right, my theme for it is that whenever they attack a Vanguard, afterwards they're going to be mesmerized by their beauty and pure acting talent, cuteness, if you will, right? And so they'll no longer attack or move or do like basic type of functions. They're too busy observing and being enamored by the Vanguard. Now this works both ways, but with the case of your units being the Lia Fel player, it's not that they're going to be enamored by whatever it is the opponent is. They'll be enamored by your own Vanguard. After they're done attacking, they'll turn back over and just view the Vanguard giving on her pop idle performance, right? Which is why the name of this particular set order is Super Idle on Stage, right? Using a Vanguard artwork, not totally a Vanguard artwork. Anyway, that aside, this all melds together into a sort of control type game plan, which ends with the end goal of literally controlling your opponent's cards. Fancy that, right? And the main crux behind this was twofold. One was the name. The idea of the Destined One of Supremacy. If you're supreme above all else as the one solo idol, then everyone in the world must be your fan. Think about it as like Rekka when she was reversed during the Break Ride era. She was somewhat like that, making the whole Rekka's Inferno spreading across all of the world. So there is that world domination element to being an idol, which is so weird to think about, man, but it is what it is, right? Another reason why I went this direction with it was because it definitely goes against Chris Rain's playstyle, right? Chris Rain has the aid of her units. They help support her, right? So what happens when those units are taken away from her? Literally taken away from her and used to fight against her. That's quite devastating. And this also kind of goes against her divine skill a little bit, because the main skill will force the opponent to call from the hand if they can't give idle counters to units on the field. So Chris Strain's Divine Skill, returning your entire board to the hand, is going to fall victim to this particular auto skill. So that's where the whole rivalry antagonizing is going to come into play for the effects between these two cards. Of course, this is definitely the most iffy one of the 6. I went really out there with that, but we did not have a lot to work with. And as all of you lyrical goons know, when it comes to this particular nation, literally anything goes. So I decided to get super creative with it. And there you have it, my thoughts on what I believe each of the 6 Destined Ones could bring to the table for their respective nations. Of course, this is super opinion based, and those customs especially are just me kind of like throwing darts on the wall, making quote unquote educated guesses, or with some of the completely brand new units like Imp Pao and Lia Fel, not even an educated guess, just a guess in general. So because of that, your guys' guesses are as good as mine, and I would love to hear said guesses because anything goes, and I think we as a community coming together on this, yeah, there's going to be a lot of bright ideas and really exciting prospects for what Bushi could be throwing at us this time around. It's a very, very hype time to be a Vanguard enthusiast, particularly an anime Vanguard enthusiast, right? Especially since it's only less than a couple weeks away until we get the start of the Divinez anime season 2. So for those of you guys who did watch this video and you did appreciate it and you're looking forward to seeing what these Divinez units do, then do consider watching my anime reactions when the season 2 does come around, because the only way to find out what these guys actually do is to see them strut their stuff on screen. So why not do it together, eh? And with that advertisement being out of the way, if that isn't to your fancy, then go ahead and check out my other Vanguard content. I've got tier lists, top 10s, other discussions, fight nights, the whole shebang, so check it out. And if you like what you can see, consider leaving a subscribe and turn on notification bell for next time I upload a video. And with that said, take care, God bless.